What if 3 of the most dangerous criminals in America vanished into the night, and were never seen again? June 11, 1962, a foggy Monday night over the San Francisco Bay. The wind was howling, the tide was rising fast, and Alcatraz Island, once thought to be inescapable, was about to be proven wrong. At exactly 9:30 p.m., prison guards walked past cell block B for the final headcount. Everything looked normal. Inmates lay on their bunks, the rhythmic silence of lockdown filling the corridor. But behind the walls of cell 138, something extraordinary was happening. Frank Morris, with ice in his veins and precision in every move, carefully lifted a fake ventilation grill and crawled out through a tunnel he and 2 brothers had dug over the last 6 months. The escape was in motion. This wasn't a Hollywood plot. It was real. 3 men, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, disappeared from Alcatraz, leaving behind nothing but plaster dummy heads on their pillows and a trail of unanswered questions that would haunt America for the next 6 decades. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The escape had been in the works for over 6 months. Every night, the 3 men chipped away at the back wall of their cells with spoons stolen from the prison cafeteria and drills made from vacuum cleaner motors. They worked quietly, covering their progress with cardboard and paint. No one noticed. No one suspected. Frank Morris, the alleged mastermind, was a genius, literally. With an IQ that rivaled top-tier engineers, he'd already escaped from multiple prisons across the U.S. He had studied the currents of the San Francisco Bay, calculated the moon phases, and built a life raft from over 50 stolen raincoats. It was all held together with stolen glue and sheer desperation. While other inmates dreamed of parole, these 3 planned the impossible. Inside each cell, a dummy head sat on the pillow, complete with human hair, smuggled from the barbershop, sculpted plaster faces, and tissue paper skin tone. From a distance, they looked horrifyingly real. And that was the point. At 6:30 a.m. the next morning, a guard tapped on Frank Morris's bars for roll call. No response. He called out again. Silence. He opened the cell and reached forward, only to watch in horror as the dummy's head rolled onto the floor. The alarm was triggered immediately. Sirens screamed across the bay. Guards sprinted through the cell block. But it was already too late. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers were gone. Within hours, the FBI, Coast Guard, and U.S. Marshals launched one of the largest manhunts in American history. Boats combed the icy waters. Helicopters flew low over Angel Island. Divers searched every inch of the ocean floor near Alcatraz. All they found was a paddle, a few raincoat scraps, and a wallet wrapped in plastic containing photos of the Anglin family. There were no bodies. No boat. No trail. How could anyone survive the freezing waters, the dangerous currents, and the sharks? The official story was simple: they drowned. But not everyone believed it. In the days that followed, the story exploded across the media. Headlines screamed, "Alcatraz escapees may be alive." Some called them heroes. Others, terrorists. But everyone had the same question. Did they make it out alive? The prison warden believed they were dead. The FBI wasn't so sure. And in the small town of Ruskin, Florida, the Anglin family kept their porch lights on, just in case their boys ever came home. To this day, tourists visit cell 138 and stare into the hole that once led to the roof and eventually the freezing San Francisco Bay. Guides tell the story with a mix of admiration and skepticism. Some visitors swear they can feel something in that corridor, something unsettled, something unfinished. There's a reason this case has never been officially closed. For decades, this mystery was treated like folklore. A prison break so daring, so cinematic, it couldn't possibly be true. But then, letters began to surface. Photos. Tips from South America. And one shocking claim from a man who said, "My name is John Anglin, and I'm still alive." 60 years later, the truth may finally be within reach. But are we ready for it? What happened to Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers after that night? Did they perish in the water, or did they start over, somewhere far from the reach of the U.S. government? The deeper we go, the stranger it gets. Frank Lee Morris was never supposed to be famous. He wasn't born into greatness. He didn't grow up with dreams of legend. But by the time he turned 35, he had already escaped from more prisons than most convicts even saw, and would become the brain behind the most infamous prison break in U.S. history. Born on September 1, 1926, in Washington, D.C., Frank didn't know what a stable home felt like. His mother vanished when he was just a toddler. His father? No one could say for sure who he was. Frank bounced between foster homes like a pinball, never staying anywhere long enough to build trust, but always long enough to learn how to survive. He was quiet, observant, and too smart for his own good. By the time he was 13, Frank was already picking locks and stealing cars. But his crimes weren't reckless, they were calculated. Teachers and probation officers noted his remarkable intellect. When he was tested for IQ, he scored 133, higher than 98% of the population. Frank didn't use that intelligence to get into college. He used it to get out of jail. His criminal record read like a rogue's resume: breaking and entering, grand theft, armed robbery, and multiple escapes from juvenile and adult detention centers. He wasn't just running from the law, he was outsmarting it at every turn. In 1955, Frank escaped from the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He was captured a year later while committing a burglary in Georgia and was promptly shipped to Leavenworth. But even Leavenworth couldn't contain him. After another attempted escape, the U.S. Bureau of Prisons had enough. They sent him to Alcatraz, the end of the line. In their minds, it was the perfect solution. But for Frank, it was just another problem to solve. Frank arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, sentenced to 14 years for bank robbery. He kept to himself. He didn't get involved in prison politics. He wasn't violent. He read obsessively. Engineering manuals, books on geography, tide patterns, anything that might be useful. Other inmates respected him but kept their distance. There was something different about him, something quiet and deliberate, like a man constantly running equations in his head. He met the Anglin brothers in the prison yard. They shared two things in common: a history of escapes, and a deep hatred for walls. Though Frank rarely spoke more than he had to, the Anglins followed his lead. He didn't need to demand loyalty, he earned it with logic and precision. Where others ranted about unfair trials or the cruelty of solitary confinement, Frank was mapping the dimensions of his cell and testing the acoustics of the air vents. He became obsessed with the idea of escape, not out of desperation, but principle. In his mind, no wall was unbeatable. Frank noticed the vent under the sink in his cell. It seemed small, almost pointless. But behind it was a 6x10-inch space that led to an unguarded utility corridor. That was the first piece of the puzzle. Then came the next: if he could get through that, he could reach the roof. From there, the bay. He took mental notes of every guard shift, every sound, every shadow. He began stealing materials: spoons from the mess hall, glue from the maintenance shop, discarded wires from broken appliances. He repurposed a vacuum motor to make a homemade drill. Every piece had a place. Every action had a purpose. It wasn't just an escape, it was an operation. Many inmates dream of freedom. Few plan it. Fewer succeed. So what made Frank different? Some say it was ego. Others say it was rage, a life of abandonment turned inward until it became ambition. But those who knew him best say it was something else. Frank didn't want to escape to freedom. He wanted to escape to control. He had spent his entire life being trapped, by the system, by foster care, by poverty. He didn't just want out of prison. He wanted to prove he was smarter than the system that built it. He wasn't afraid of dying in the bay. He was afraid of dying without ever taking the shot. By early 1962, Frank had everything in place. The Anglin brothers were on board. Another inmate, Alan West, was recruited but would later be left behind. The dummy heads were made. The raft was hidden. The escape route was mapped. All they needed was the right night. June 11th. The fog was thick. The tides were just right. The guards were tired. The stars had finally aligned. As he crawled out of his cell that night, Frank didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew he'd never see cell 138 again. Some brothers fight. Some grow apart. But John and Clarence Anglin, they were a unit. Always had been. Always would be. If Frank Morris was the brain behind the Alcatraz escape, the Anglin brothers were its beating heart. Loyal, quiet, determined, and, above all, inseparable. John William Anglin was born in 1930. Clarence, the younger by just over a year, came along in 1931. The two were part of a large, poor farming family that lived near Donaldsonville, Georgia. Later, they moved north to Ruskin, Florida, where their parents worked as seasonal laborers, picking fruit and vegetables up and down the East Coast. Every summer, the family would load into a beat-up truck and follow the harvest. It was a hard life, no air conditioning, no steady home, no breaks. But for John and Clarence, it was freedom. They'd swim in creeks, fish with string and bent nails, and make games out of the nothingness they had. Their favorite spot was the Apalachicola River. Cold, fast, unforgiving. The kind of water that made other kids shiver. But not the Anglins. They swam in it like it was part of them. Poverty breeds resourcefulness. Sometimes, it also breeds trouble. In their teens, the Anglins started stealing. First it was small, fruit, scrap metal, the occasional wallet left on a bus seat. Then it escalated. Bank robberies. Dozens of them. They were never violent. In fact, they were oddly polite, always robbing after hours, never firing a weapon. But they were good at it. Too good. By the early 1950s, they had been arrested multiple times. The FBI finally caught up with them during a string of robberies across the Midwest. They were sentenced to federal prison, and bounced from facility to facility for bad behavior and escape attempts. Eventually, like Frank Morris, they were sent to Alcatraz. That was supposed to be the end of their story. It was just the beginning. When John and Clarence arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, they were assigned to neighboring cells on B Block. To most guards, they were model inmates, quiet, cooperative, clean. But that was part of the plan. They were observing. Listening. Memorizing. The brothers spoke in low voices, often in a southern drawl so thick most people couldn't understand them. But between themselves, they communicated almost telepathically. A glance. A nod. A tap on the cell bar. That's all it took. Clarence was the more cautious one, always worried about the details. John had the guts. The fire. The belief they could pull off what no one else dared. Together, they were balanced. It wasn't long before they met Frank Morris. At first, there was distance, mutual respect, but not trust. Frank had the brains, sure, but the Anglins had something else, an unbreakable bond. Over time, the three of them began to talk, late at night, muffled through cell walls and whispers during yard breaks. It wasn't long before the idea took root. Escape. Frank had the plan. The Anglins had the muscle, and the loyalty. Where Frank was surgical, John and Clarence were dependable. They never asked dumb questions. They didn't panic. They followed instructions like soldiers. If Frank was the general, the Anglins were his most trusted men. While most inmates lost touch with their families, the Anglins stayed connected. Their mother, Rachel, never missed a birthday. She sent letters, baked cakes, and even painted their portraits from photographs. She refused to believe her boys were bad. They just got stuck in the wrong life, she'd say. But they'll come back. I know they will. Even when the government told her they had drowned, she kept setting a plate for them at Thanksgiving. Even when everyone else gave up, she didn't. One letter she received a few years after the escape said only, "We're safe. We'll see you when it's safe for you too. Tell no one. J.N.C. No return address. No way to verify." But to her, it was enough. People often ask, why would anyone try to escape from Alcatraz? The odds of survival were almost zero. But for the Anglins, the answer was simple: each other. They had been locked up in different prisons before. It was torture. Being separated was worse than the prison food, the cold nights, or the loneliness. They'd rather die together in the freezing waters of the bay than live another year apart behind bars. Frank gave them the map. But it was their brotherhood that gave them the courage. The escape cemented their place in American folklore. But their story didn't end there. In the decades after that night, strange things began happening. A photograph mailed anonymously to a U.S. Marshal showed two men in Brazil who looked eerily like John and Clarence, older, tanned, and smiling next to a palm tree. A man claiming to be a cousin swore he saw them in Texas in 1978. And one prison guard's daughter said her father once whispered, "Those boys made it out. I saw the boat myself." Were they true? No one knows for sure. But one thing's clear. If the Anglin brothers are still out there, they're together. Always were. Always will be. There was a reason they called it the Rock. Not just because of the jagged slab of stone it sat on in the middle of San Francisco Bay, but because it was cold, hard, and unforgiving. From the day Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary opened in 1934, it was marketed as inescapable, the end of the line for America's most dangerous criminals. If you ended up here, it meant one thing. You were done. Alcatraz sat just 1.25 miles from the mainland, but for inmates, it might as well have been 1,000. The water surrounding it was bone-chilling year-round, between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 13 degrees Celsius, with swirling currents, jagged rocks, and relentless wind. Escape meant plunging into that frigid abyss, in the dark, with no light, no raft, and nowhere to hide. The prison itself? Designed for zero tolerance. Steel-reinforced cells. Guard towers. Barred walkways with direct lines of fire. Armed officers patrolled 24/7. Even the air felt different, thick with tension, thin on hope. Each cell, 5 feet wide, 9 feet deep. Concrete floors. A small sink. A toilet. A metal bed. That was it. There was nowhere to run. And worse, nowhere to feel human. To outsiders, Alcatraz was where monsters were buried alive. To the men inside, it was more complex than that. Inmates woke at 6:30 a.m. Count. Roll call. Breakfast, oatmeal or powdered eggs. Then off to assigned jobs, kitchen duty, laundry, license plate stamping. Silence was enforced. Solitary confinement, a pitch-black hole known as the strip cell, waited for any violation. But worst of all, was the sound. At night, when the wind was low, prisoners could hear laughter and music drifting across the bay from Fisherman's Wharf. People dancing, drinking, living free. So close, yet totally out of reach. Many inmates said that was the real punishment. The walls don't kill you. The hope does, one inmate once said. Alcatraz was home to some of the most notorious names in crime. Al Capone, the Chicago gangster who played banjo in the prison band. George "Machine Gun" Kelly, a former kidnapper turned docile model inmate. Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, who raised canaries and wrote scientific papers on bird diseases. But not even these men ever attempted escape. Because they knew the truth: you don't escape the rock. Alcatraz's reputation wasn't just built on steel and concrete, it was built on fear. Prison officials spread stories of men being sucked under by the currents, of sharks prowling the waters, not entirely true, of failed escapees shot dead or washed up on the shore. From 1934 to 1963, 36 men tried to escape Alcatraz in 14 separate attempts. All failed, except one. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't just break out of prison, they broke through history. But how? Despite its fortress-like exterior, Alcatraz had vulnerabilities. The infrastructure was aging. The guards were overworked. Maintenance was underfunded. The prison's location made it logistically expensive to operate. Supplies had to be ferried in daily. Staff turnover was high. The sea salt corroded metal fixtures, including the air vents that Frank Morris would later crawl through. Even the cells themselves, supposedly airtight, had thin, crumbling concrete in certain spots. Frank noticed that. He wasn't just planning an escape, he was studying the prison's anatomy like a surgeon. And slowly, over months, he found the weaknesses no one else had dared to look for. By 1962, Alcatraz was showing its age. There were rumors in Washington that the prison might shut down entirely. The costs were too high. The security wasn't perfect anymore. And then, the escape happened. 3 men gone without a trace. Not only did it rattle the FBI, it shattered the myth. Suddenly, the rock didn't look so indestructible. If they made it out, that meant the system had failed. And if the system failed once, it could fail again. What still stuns people today is how meticulously the escape was pulled off, right under the noses of some of the strictest guards in the country. Fake walls. Homemade tools. A raft made from stolen raincoats. And heads made of soap, plaster, and real hair to fool nightly checks. And all of this happened in plain sight. The guards never suspected a thing until it was too late. One officer later said, "We weren't just outsmarted. We were outclassed." Though the prison didn't shut down immediately after the escape, it was the beginning of the end. In 1963, less than a year later, Alcatraz officially closed. The government claimed it was due to operating costs. But many believed the escape was the final straw. The prison had lost its aura. It was no longer feared. It had been beaten. It started with a spoon. Not a weapon. Not a tool forged in secret. Just an old, dull cafeteria spoon. But in the hands of Frank Morris, it might as well have been a key. Every night, after lights out, while guards patrolled the cell block and fellow inmates drifted off to sleep, Frank would crouch under his sink, jam that spoon into the air vent, and quietly scrape the crumbling concrete. Bit by bit. Hour by hour. Night after night. He was digging his way to freedom, through the wall. Frank wasn't reckless. He didn't start chipping until he was sure the wall behind his sink had thinned with age. Years of saltwater corrosion had made the concrete brittle. He tapped the wall gently at first, listening to the echo. Soft in one spot. Weakness. It was just wide enough, barely 6 inches high and 10 inches across, to fit his shoulders through if he could break it open. So he started digging. Spoons weren't the only things they used. With help from John and Clarence Anglin, Frank fashioned tools out of stolen parts. A hand drill, built from a vacuum cleaner motor, sharpened metal bits, and wire scavenged from the prison workshop. Chisels, shaped from spoon handles and butter knives. Even a homemade bellows, crafted from an old accordion, to vent dust and fumes into the hallway while they worked. The noise? They masked it with music. The prison allowed inmates to play instruments and listen to radio shows during certain hours. That sound cover became their shield. On some nights, Clarence would strum a guitar quietly or whistle near the bars, distracting the guards, covering the scrape of spoon on stone. It was a symphony of survival. Behind each cell, a narrow utility corridor ran along the back wall of the block. It was filled with pipes and wiring, designed for maintenance workers, not inmates. If they could break through their cell walls, they could crawl into that corridor unseen. It was their highway out. Frank broke through first. John and Clarence followed, chipping at their own walls in unison. They shared tools, coordinated shifts, and stashed debris behind cardboard mock-ups painted to match the cell walls. They were digging graves, not for themselves, but for the lie that Alcatraz was impenetrable. Of course, the guards would notice if 3 inmates were missing during a bed check. So Frank, once again, got creative. He sculpted 3 heads from soap, toilet paper, and plaster stolen from the prison art class. With a little paint and some clippings of real hair from the prison barbershop, the dummies looked horrifyingly lifelike. At night, the men tucked the heads into their pillows, pulled up their blankets, and snuck out into the corridor. Every morning, they were back in place before the 5:30 a.m. count. It was a nightly game of illusion and risk, one mistake away from solitary or death. Breaking out of the prison was just the first step. Surviving the bay was the real challenge. That's where the raincoats came in. Over the months, the men quietly collected more than 50 prison-issued raincoats, traded, stolen, bartered for cigarettes. Using heated pipes and shoe glue, they fused them together into a makeshift life raft and life vests. They tested them in secret, submerging sections in the sink, sealing seams with more glue, studying how they held air. It was crude. Ugly. But it could float. It had to. There was supposed to be a 4th man, Alan West, who had been digging his own tunnel for months alongside the others. But on the night of the escape, something went wrong. His tunnel opening, already tight, had hardened after recent repairs. When he tried to squeeze through, he couldn't budge the grill he had cemented back into place. He pushed. Kicked. Panicked. But by the time he freed himself, the others were gone. West sat alone in the corridor, staring at the empty darkness, the sound of ocean wind rushing through the maintenance shaft. He returned to his cell and lay still, until the guards found the dummy head the next morning. By early June 1962, everything was ready. The raft was stashed on the roof of the utility corridor. The tools were hidden. The dummy heads were perfected. All they needed was the right night. Low tides. Heavy fog. A slow guard rotation. June 11th checked all 3 boxes. The plan was locked in. That evening, after lights out, the men slipped through their tunnels for the last time. One by one, they crawled into the corridor, dragging tools and bags behind them. West never made it. But Frank, John, and Clarence climbed up the utility pipe, squeezed through a vent onto the roof, and vanished into the fog. 3 shadows against the San Francisco skyline, barely more than silhouettes. But they weren't ghosts. They were free men. What would you risk to breathe free air again? That's not a question most people have to answer. But on the night of June 11, 1962, 3 men chose to risk everything: cold water, darkness, drowning, bullets, just for the chance to live on their own terms. This wasn't just an escape. It was a declaration. At 9:30 p.m., the final count was done. The cell block dimmed. Guards made their rounds as usual. No alarms. No extra patrols. Everything was routine. Inside cell 138, Frank Morris placed the dummy head on his pillow, adjusted the blanket to make his outline look believable, and gave the silent signal. 2 cells down, Clarence Anglin did the same. Then John. No words. Just nods. They knew this was it. One by one, they slipped beneath their sinks and into the holes they had spent months carving. Each crawlspace was barely wide enough for a man to slither through, shoulders scraping against rough concrete. Frank led the way. Behind the cell walls, the utility corridor was pitch black, only the faint orange glow from a single maintenance light flickering overhead. Pipes hissed with steam. The air was hot and thick with dust. It felt like crawling through the bowels of a dying machine. They moved fast, trained by repetition. They had practiced this dozens of times. But tonight was different. Tonight, they weren't coming back. Back in cell 140, Alan West panicked. His grill was jammed. The cement had dried tighter than he expected. He pulled and pried until his fingers bled. He whispered into the vent, hoping Frank might hear. But the others were already gone. He sat on the floor for a long time, the muffled sound of footsteps disappearing above him. Alone. Angry. Staring at the wall he'd spent months carving, only to miss his moment by inches. Frank, John, and Clarence reached the top of the utility corridor. From there, they climbed a vertical vent pipe leading up to the cellhouse roof, a 30-foot ascent in total darkness, clutching rusted pipes and damp masonry. Frank reached the top first. He removed the metal grate they'd loosened weeks earlier. One final pull, and the roof opened above them like a portal to the unknown. They were out of the cell house. But they were far from safe. The roof was wet with fog and slick tar. Any sound, footsteps, tools clanking, could alert the tower guards. Spotlights swept in slow circles over the island. The wind howled. The bay churned below. The three men ducked low, running in crouches across the flat rooftop toward the north utility corridor, where they had hidden their raft and life vests. They paused only once, to catch their breath. Clarence whispered, "Still want to turn back?" Frank just smiled. "We already did the hard part." From the rooftop, they descended a drain pipe onto the ground near the rear perimeter fence, cutting through with makeshift tools. Past that, the shoreline. They reached the edge of the island around 10 p.m. No lights. Just fog. The raft was assembled quickly, unrolled and inflated using the accordion bellows they'd rigged weeks earlier. It was crude, but it held air. They loaded it with wooden paddles, makeshift life vests, and a small sack of supplies. Behind them, the prison loomed in silence, still believing they were asleep in their cells. Ahead of them, cold water, fast tides, and 1.25 miles of deadly uncertainty. No one knows the exact moment they launched. Estimates place it between 10:10 and 10:30 p.m. The wind was strong. The fog was dense. Visibility dropped to just a few feet. But the tides were in their favor, pulling westward toward Angel Island. Frank took the lead paddle. The Anglins rowed in sync beside him. No flashlights. No radios. Just the sound of water slapping rubber and waves crashing against the rocks. It's said that on clear nights, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge from Alcatraz. But that night, it was swallowed by mist, like everything else. They didn't look back. At 7:15 a.m., June 12, a guard doing the morning count paused at Frank Morris's cell. Something looked off. The dummy head had slipped slightly. The officer tapped the bars. No movement. He called backup. Within minutes, the guards were banging on the other two cells. 3 dummy heads. 3 empty beds. The alarm screamed across the island. By 7:30 a.m., the prison was on full lockdown. Boats were deployed. Helicopters scrambled. The FBI was called. The Coast Guard began combing the shoreline. But it was too late. The bay was silent. The fog had lifted. And Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin were gone. That question has haunted investigators, families, and Americans for over 60 years. Official reports claimed they likely drowned. But no bodies were ever found. No clothing. No raft. Nothing definitive. But the FBI couldn't explain. The paddle discovered on Angel Island. The plastic-wrapped personal effects found near the Marin shore. The letter received in 2013 claiming, "I'm John Anglin, and I'm still alive." Whether they lived or died that night, they made history. By sunrise on June 12, 1962, Alcatraz was in chaos. 3 inmates had escaped what was believed to be the most secure prison in America. The press swarmed. The public panicked. And inside the bureau, one thing was clear. This wasn't just an escape. This was a national embarrassment. By 8 a.m., every federal agency in the Bay Area was mobilized. The FBI took lead. The U.S. Marshals began tracking known family contacts. The Coast Guard launched boats and choppers to scour the bay. San Francisco police set up checkpoints on bridges, piers, and highways. But the trail was cold from the start. Despite the intense manhunt, no one could find any trace of Frank Morris, John Anglin, or Clarence Anglin. The raft was gone. No footprints. No wet clothing. No bodies. No cries for help. Within hours, theories exploded. They drowned. The official line. The currents were too strong. The water too cold. No one could survive that swim. They made it. Underground rumors swirled. Inmates whispered it was an inside job. Some claimed a boat was waiting in the fog. They were dead, but the bodies were hidden. Shark attacks, washed out to sea, stuck under a pier somewhere no one thought to look. Reporters asked hard questions. Citizens wanted harder answers. The press nicknamed them the Ghosts of Alcatraz. Alan West, the man left behind, had a choice: talk or take the fall. He chose to talk. West told investigators that the plan had been brewing for over a year. He gave up the details. The digging. The tools. The dummy heads. The raft made of raincoats. He even tried to convince them that he had masterminded part of it. But West had a reputation, a talker, not a doer. Still, his intel gave the FBI a timeline, and a list of places to look. Back in Florida, the Anglin family watched the news unfold with a mixture of fear and pride. Their mother, Rachel, refused to believe her boys were dead. They're smart. Smarter than they're given credit for. The FBI tapped the family's phone lines, monitored their mail, and even had agents attend family funerals in disguise, waiting to see if John or Clarence would show. They never did. But every Christmas, Rachel claimed she got roses sent from an anonymous source. No return address. Just a card. Love always, J&C. Coincidence? Or message? Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy was briefed personally. President John F. Kennedy was informed by noon. This wasn't just a prison break. It was a public relations disaster. If 3 men could escape from Alcatraz, what did that say about the rest of the federal prison system? A congressional review was launched. Budgets were re-examined. Security across other prisons was upgraded. Quiet conversations began about closing Alcatraz for good. And all the while, the 3 men were still nowhere. 2 days after the escape, authorities found a paddle on Angel Island, along with a crude plastic-wrapped bundle containing a wallet with family photos, addresses for relatives of the Anglins, a slip of paper with a few Portuguese words. Investigators couldn't confirm it belonged to the escapees. But it was the closest thing to evidence they had. For a while, attention turned to South America. Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina. All had become havens for criminals fleeing U.S. law. Could they have made it that far? Could someone have helped them disappear? The FBI quietly began tracking down leads in foreign countries. In 1979, the FBI officially closed the case, claiming the men had likely drowned. They issued death certificates for Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers. But not everyone believed it. Some agents continued to follow leads privately. U.S. Marshals kept the case active. And family members of the Anglins insisted they'd received secret messages, even photographs, proving the brothers were alive. Officially, case closed. Unofficially, the manhunt never really ended. Over the next few decades, there were hundreds of reported sightings. 2 men in a bar in Brazil who looked just like the Anglins. A tip from a man in California who claimed to have sold a car to someone with no fingerprints. A photo mailed anonymously to the FBI in 2013, showing 2 older men in sunglasses standing next to a hut in Brazil, one with an unmistakable resemblance to John Anglin. Nothing was ever confirmed. But nothing was ever fully dismissed. Officially, the escapees were dead. Unofficially, they were legends. From backwoods bars to Brazilian beaches, reports began trickling in, whispers, blurry photos, vague letters, all pointing to one possibility: the Alcatraz escapees made it out alive. And if they lived, where did they go? Just months after the escape, the FBI received its first tip. A man working on a farm in Fresno, California, claimed 2 drifters had come through asking for directions to Modesto. One looked like Frank Morris. They were polite, quiet, paid in cash, and never seen again. Later that year, a bartender in New Orleans claimed 2 men, sunburned, with Florida accents, had been asking about boats headed south to Mexico. The leads were checked. Dead ends. But they kept coming. In 1975, a former family friend of the Anglins traveled to Rio de Janeiro. While there, she claimed to have seen John and Clarence on a farm outside the city. She said they recognized her. Smiled. Then disappeared before she could follow. But the story didn't truly catch fire until 2013, when the FBI received an anonymous envelope. Inside was a photograph: 2 elderly men, standing beside a makeshift hut. Both wearing sunglasses. One bore an eerie resemblance to John Anglin. There was no note. No return address. Just the photo. Facial recognition software wasn't conclusive, but some agents believed it was them. Then came the biggest shock of all. In 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter. It was old. Faded. But the return name hit like a thunderbolt. My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old now and in bad shape. The letter claimed Frank had died in 2005. Clarence in 2011. And that John was dying of cancer. If you announce on TV that I will be promised no more than 1 year in jail and medical help, I will write back to tell you exactly where I am. But he never wrote back. The letter was tested. The handwriting was close. The fingerprints were inconclusive. The FBI classified the lead as active, but low priority. And still, the trail stayed warm. For over a decade after the escape, every Mother's Day, a bouquet of fresh roses was delivered to Rachel Anglin, the escapee's mother, in Florida. No return address. No card. Just roses. Neighbors reported seeing 2 strange men in dark suits standing across the street during the funeral of John and Clarence's father in 1973. Neither spoke. Neither approached the grave. After the service, they vanished. Family members swore it was them. The FBI watched. Took notes. But could prove nothing. Privately, some agents weren't so sure the men drowned. In internal memos, several expressed doubts. The raft had been well constructed. The tides were favorable. No bodies were ever recovered, and bodies usually do resurface in those conditions. One agent wrote, "These weren't reckless criminals. They were planners. Builders. If anyone could have pulled it off, it was these three." Even after the FBI closed its file in 1979, the U.S. Marshals kept the case open. Why? Because as long as the escapees were alive, they were still fugitives. And as recently as 2020, the Marshals released updated age-progressed sketches of all three men, what they might look like in their 90s. The captions read, "Wanted. For federal escape. Not presumed dead. Not case closed. Just wanted." Over the decades, one theory gained traction. That the men had fled to Brazil and lived quietly under new identities, perhaps with help from contacts in Florida or Cuba. A 2015 History Channel documentary even claimed photographic evidence proved John Anglin was living in Brazil as late as 1975. Critics called the theory sensational. But no one could debunk it completely. Over 60 years later, no one has found a body. No one has definitively proven survival either. But the letters, the sightings, the photo, and the roses all point in one direction. They made it. Or at the very least, someone wants us to think they did. He called himself Texas. That's all anyone ever really knew. He was tall, wiry, with a crooked grin and a prison tattoo that had long since faded. A former Alcatraz inmate, he served 5 years on the Rock and got out in the mid-70s. And in 1981, after a few drinks at a seedy Oakland bar, he said too much. Tex had a habit of talking when he drank. He liked to tell stories, mostly exaggerated, about the old days inside. He'd drop names no one else dared say. Frank. The Anglins. Even Warden Blackwell. But one night, he got quiet, leaned in, and told a story he never told before. "I helped M. the night they broke out." "Yeah, I did." According to the bartender, Tex claimed he'd been part of the crew that cleaned the workshops, the same shops where Frank had access to motors, wires, and glue. "They gave me $10 and half a carton of smokes. All I did was leave a wrench in the drainpipe. That's it. Just a wrench." And then he said this. "They didn't drown. I know that for a fact. They had a ride waitin'. Boat came in from Sausalito. Silent as a ghost." When asked how he knew, Tex just smiled. "Because I was supposed to go too." The bartender didn't think much of it at first. But the next time Tex came in, he seemed nervous. Said someone had followed him home. 2 men in suits. He stopped drinking. Then, a week later, he disappeared. Left his flophouse room unlocked. Clothes in the closet. Half a sandwich in the fridge. Gone. Police chalked it up to another drifter moving on. But some believed Tex wasn't just a talker, he was a witness. And someone wanted him quiet. Around the same time, a retired Alcatraz guard, James Rourke, gave a quiet, off-the-record interview to a local journalist. He was 82, living in a senior home in Daly City. He didn't want his name published. He didn't want his pension messed with. But what he said? It sent chills. That night, the fog was thick, but the water was too quiet. "I heard something. A boat. A motor. Right around 10:30 p.m. I reported it. They told me I must have been hearing things." He claimed other guards heard it too. But the higher-ups told them to shut it down. No one wanted the headline to be, "Alcatraz isn't escape-proof." So they buried it. When asked if he believed the men made it, Rourke didn't hesitate. "They made it. No way they didn't." He passed away 2 months later. In 1992, a box of old evidence from the escape case was found in an FBI warehouse in Quantico. It included the dummy heads, fragments of the raincoat raft, A broken paddle. A diary page from a guard who worked the midnight shift on June 11, 1962. That page was missing from the official report. It said, "Saw something in the water. Flashlight reflection. Thought it might be a seal. Now not so sure." By the time reporters requested access, the box had been moved, no longer listed in inventory. Official response: no such box exists. For the government, Alcatraz represented control. If 3 men beat that system, it wasn't just a prison break, it was a crack in the foundation. Shutting down the prison less than a year later wasn't just about costs. It was about optics. Pressure from the Kennedy administration. Public panic. Global perception. If Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers lived, that meant the system failed. America's most secure prison could be beaten. And the men who did it got away. So, maybe the best answer was to say they didn't make it. Let the myth die in the fog. Over the years, several other former inmates claimed they knew something about the escape. Each story had common threads. A mystery boat. Tools that shouldn't have been accessible. A 4th man who got cold feet, Alan West. And possible external help, either a corrupt staff member or an outsider. Some stories were clearly embellished. But others? Too detailed. Too consistent. Too convincing to dismiss. And then those storytellers. They stopped talking. Even today, the debate rages. Some say it's all hearsay, urban legend wrapped in conspiracy. Others argue, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So which is it? Was Tex just a drunk with a big mouth? Was the guard's confession real or just the regrets of an old man? Was there really a boat? Or are we chasing ghosts in fog? Rio de Janeiro, a place where secrets can be buried beneath the heat of its beaches, the sway of samba rhythms, and the fog of rumors. It was in the early 1980s that the story of John and Clarence Anglin's possible survival started taking shape in Brazil. The whispers came from former American expats, travelers, and local Brazilians alike. They had seen 2 older men who looked a lot like the Anglin brothers living in a remote village just outside Porto Alegre, far from the familiar tourist spots. But could it be true? Or was it just another case of wishful thinking? In 1982, a man named João walked into a small café in Porto Alegre, the capital of Rio Grande do Sul state. He was American, or so he claimed. A rugged man in his mid-40s, with weathered skin, his eyes as sharp as the Andes mountains he'd crossed years ago. He told the café owner, a Brazilian woman named Lucia, that he was from Florida, but didn't give a last name. Lucia thought nothing of it at first. But then she heard the name Anglin. The man smiled slightly when she mentioned the famous escape from Alcatraz. "I knew them. John and Clarence were old friends of mine." João didn't give details. He didn't need to. His accent was soft, his speech measured. He had stories of escaping the U.S. law in the late 1960s, of moving to the Amazon, of getting lost in the wilderness. But the strangest part of his story was his refusal to acknowledge the escapees directly. He would always say, "I didn't know them by their real names. They had new ones." In 1985, Lucia was shocked when João handed her a photograph. It was a faded, black-and-white image, showing 2 men standing side by side in a dense forest. Their faces were blurry, but one of them seemed familiar. Lucia swore she recognized them. John and Clarence Anglin. But there was something else strange. João's face was also in the photo, standing in the background, barely visible. His eyes were almost gleaming, knowing something the others didn't. When Lucia asked João directly, he simply laughed, as if to dismiss her curiosity. In a place like this, you learn to disappear. The world forgets. It's too big. But Lucia didn't forget. She kept the photograph. In 1991, Lucia, now determined to find answers, contacted a local journalist named Carlos Silva who had ties to American tourists. Carlos was known for investigating disappearances, especially those involving Americans in Brazil. Carlos was intrigued but skeptical. When he saw the photo Lucia had kept, his expression changed. He'd seen similar images before. American fugitives living under new identities. He'd even heard of a man named João, who had lived in various parts of the Brazilian countryside under the name Juan Delgado. Carlos made inquiries. He began to track down the places João had lived, the towns he had visited. The result? Nothing. João had disappeared, just as quietly as he had arrived. In the years that followed, other expats and local farmers came forward with bits of stories. A man matching Clarence's description had been seen working on a farm near Parana in 1973. The locals remembered him as a quiet, hard-working man who never stayed in one place for long. Another witness, an American traveler who had been to Brazil in the 1970s, swore he met John Anglin at a small village in São Paulo. The man had shown him photographs of his family, but none were in color. He didn't like to talk about the past, but his eyes told me everything. He was afraid. Brazil's history of welcoming fugitives from around the world is well documented. The U.S. government had struggled for years to track criminals hiding out in remote Brazilian towns, often with the local police turning a blind eye or offering shelter. The Anglins could have easily blended into this environment. The tropical climate. The vastness of Brazil's rural areas. And, most importantly, the absence of extradition treaties with the United States at the time made it an ideal destination for men trying to escape their past. So why didn't João speak openly? Why did he give hints, but never give answers? Was he just another man living in fear of retribution? Or was he complicit, protecting his old friends from discovery, unwilling to let the world find out what had really happened in 1962? In 1997, a strange phone call was made to the FBI. It was from a payphone in São Paulo. The caller didn't speak at first, but after a few moments, he said, "John is alive. I saw him a few months ago. The Anglins are hiding in the jungle. But they're safe." When the FBI traced the call, it came from a remote village. But by the time agents arrived, the man who had called, and his entire village, had disappeared. As of today, there are still no definitive answers about whether the Anglins made it to Brazil, or if they lived out their days there. Many believe they died in the years following their escape, perhaps in the Amazon, perhaps in a small, unnamed village. But the question remains, could they have escaped? Could João have known them? Could the Brazil connection really be the missing piece of the puzzle? The Anglins, John, Clarence, and Frank, might not have escaped from Alcatraz as we thought. But did they escape from the law, the system, the world itself? And if so, what price did they pay for their freedom? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? It was the kind of letter that arrived on a gray, rainy afternoon in San Francisco, the kind that could change everything. The envelope was old, yellowed at the edges, and postmarked from a small town in Northern California, near the coast. It had no return address, just a single note that read, "They made it. And I know where they are." The letter was addressed to a journalist named Sandra Miller, a seasoned reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle who had spent over a decade investigating the Alcatraz escape. Sandra had been writing stories about the escapees for years, but this letter, this one, was different. The handwriting was neat, but there was an urgency to it. The tone was intimate but cryptic. "They aren't dead. They escaped, and I know exactly where they went. There's a place in the woods, not far from the bay. It's a place where few people ever venture. If you really want to know the truth, go there. But you may never come back." It was signed simply, "A friend of Frank." Sandra's first instinct was to discard the letter. After all, the escapees had been presumed dead or lost to history for decades. She had seen all kinds of tips come through her office, from fake confessions to outlandish theories about underground bunkers and hidden caves. But there was something about the tone of this letter that struck her. The reference to "a friend of Frank" hinted at something personal, someone who might have had direct knowledge of the men's fate. Sandra wasn't one to chase after every wild lead, but this was different. She had spent years chasing ghosts, but this letter, it could be real. The following day, Sandra set out on a road trip to the small town near the coast, where the letter had been postmarked. It was a 2-hour drive from the city, through winding roads that hugged the cliffs of the Pacific coast. The town, called Point Reyes, was small and secluded, a quiet fishing village that had changed little since the 1960s. Sandra had no idea what she was looking for, but she had a feeling she was on the verge of uncovering something monumental. Upon arriving in Point Reyes, Sandra spoke to a few locals at a rustic cafe near the water. They were friendly enough, but when she mentioned the name Alcatraz, they grew cautious. One elderly woman named Grace, who had lived in the area for over 50 years, gave Sandra a cryptic look when asked about the letter. "You're looking for them, aren't you?" Grace asked, her voice low. "There's always talk. Old stories, old ghosts. But you won't find what you're looking for out here. Trust me. Some things are better left buried." Sandra didn't press further with Grace, but the woman's words stuck with her. There was something about the woods outside of town, something that made people uncomfortable. Could this be the place the letter referred to? Could the escapees have hidden here all these years? As Sandra ventured into the woods, she followed a series of vague directions that had been included in the letter. The weather had turned stormy, and the dense fog that often rolled in from the sea made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But Sandra persisted, the pull of the mystery growing stronger with each step. Eventually, after hours of searching, she found it, a small, weather-beaten cabin tucked away in the trees. It was nearly invisible from the main trail, surrounded by thick brush and overgrown vegetation. No one seemed to have lived there in years. But the structure was solid, and there was a sense of stillness about it. Sandra's heart raced as she approached. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The inside was dark, lit only by the dim light filtering in through the small windows. And then she saw it, on a dusty old table, a map. The map was crudely drawn, but it appeared to show the layout of Alcatraz Island and the surrounding coastline. There were red X's marked at different points, coordinates that seemed to correspond to various places around San Francisco Bay. One of the X's was in Point Reyes. Another marked a location just across the water from Angel Island. The final X was in a location farther north, near Mendocino, a place Sandra had never visited before. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. The map confirmed what she had been hoping for, the possibility that the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris had made it to the mainland, and had been living right under the authorities' noses all these years. But who had left the map? And why? Was this the final clue to their survival? In the center of the cabin, Sandra found an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The handwriting inside was unmistakable, it belonged to Frank Morris. The entries were sporadic, but they chronicled a man who was terrified, but determined to escape. Frank described the months leading up to the break, detailing how they had gathered materials, made plans, and navigated the waters around Alcatraz. One particular entry stood out. "The hardest part is knowing we might not make it. But the world doesn't know we're still alive. And that's what keeps us going. As long as no one finds us, we'll keep moving. But I can't help but think they'll be looking for us forever." It was dated June 1963, a year after their disappearance. As Sandra left the cabin, she felt a sense of closure, but also a nagging feeling that there was more to this story than she had uncovered. The Anglins and Frank Morris had made it. They had escaped, and had lived out their lives, hidden from the world, in places no one would ever think to look. The map and journal were likely the final clue, confirming the impossible, the escapees had survived, and had been hiding in plain sight all these years. But there was one more question left unanswered. Who had left the letter, and why? After weeks of following dead-end leads and piecing together the mystery of the Alcatraz escapees, Sandra Miller found herself on the doorstep of a man who might know more than anyone else about the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris. His name was Hank Turner, a man in his 70s who lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of Point Reyes. Hank had a reputation as someone who had known the escapees well. But not just as a casual acquaintance, Hank was said to have been friends with the men during their final days in prison. For years, Hank had lived quietly, keeping to himself. But now, with the increasing attention to the Anglin case, Sandra was convinced that Hank held the final piece of the puzzle. Sandra arrived at Hank's cottage just as the afternoon sun began to fade, casting a golden hue over the rugged coastline. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding with anticipation. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man with a stooped back, gray hair, and weathered hands. His face was kind but guarded, eyes sharp despite his age. "I don't have much to say," Hank said before Sandra could introduce herself. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "But if you're looking for them, you're wasting your time. They're gone, just like everyone else who disappears around here." Sandra was taken aback by his immediate response, but she didn't give up. She asked him about his connection to the escapees, hoping to find some crack in his guarded exterior. After a long pause, Hank invited her in. The interior of his cottage was sparsely decorated, with only a few pieces of old furniture and photographs scattered on the walls. There was a faint odor of tobacco smoke, and the air felt heavy with the weight of years spent in solitude. Once they sat down, Hank reluctantly began to speak. "You want to know about the Anglins? I knew them. But not in the way you think. We weren't close. We were just men in the same place, prison. But I saw them, every day. Frank, especially. He had a mind that could outsmart anyone. He could tell you stories and make you believe them. But he didn't trust anyone, not even the people closest to him." Sandra listened intently. This was the most direct connection she had gotten to the men, and Hank's words held weight. He continued, his voice distant, as though remembering a time he had long tried to forget. "John and Clarence, they were the quiet ones. But Frank was different. He had ideas. He always wanted to get out. He was obsessed with freedom, but more than that, he wanted to prove he could do it. Prove that even Alcatraz wasn't enough to keep a man caged." Sandra had heard stories about Frank's intelligence, his meticulous planning for the escape. But hearing it from someone who had been there, someone who had shared the same grim surroundings, was a new revelation. Hank's voice grew lower, as if to emphasize the gravity of his next words. "I didn't know the details, not until after the escape. But Frank had a plan. He wasn't about to just get out and disappear, he wanted to escape Alcatraz like a shadow, never leaving a trace. And that's exactly what he did. He knew the guards, the schedules, the weaknesses of the prison like the back of his hand. But even more important, he knew how to blend in, to hide in plain sight." Hank paused for a moment, as if considering whether or not to reveal more. "They didn't just run away. That's the mistake everyone makes. They didn't think they were running from something. They were running to something. They had a plan. A place. And I think they made it. That's the part no one wants to believe." Sandra's heart raced. This was the first time anyone had said outright that the escapees might have succeeded. "Where did they go?" she asked, unable to hold back. Hank hesitated. He glanced at the door as though making sure no one else could overhear, then leaned in closer. "They went north. Up to the forests. There's a place near Mendocino, where no one would ever think to look. It's not just wilderness, it's isolated, hidden from the world." Sandra felt a rush of excitement. Mendocino, the same place marked on the map she had found in the abandoned cabin. "How do you know this?" she asked. Hank exhaled deeply, his eyes clouding with regret. Because I was the one who showed them the way. I knew that place well. It's remote. Perfect for someone who needs to disappear. But after they left, after they made it there, I never saw them again. They didn't come back, and I didn't ask any questions. As the conversation continued, Sandra learned more about Hank's life during the prison years. He had been a quiet observer, a man who had seen many criminals come and go. But Frank, John, and Clarence were different. They were survivors, men who knew how to adapt and think outside the box. And Hank had helped them. Perhaps out of a sense of camaraderie, or perhaps because he admired their determination. But he didn't want to be caught in their escape. He had made it clear he would remain behind, watching from the shadows. I didn't want to be part of their crime. I just wanted to see them succeed. And I did. But I don't need to be remembered for it. They're better off forgotten. Hank's words hit Sandra harder than she expected. Was it possible that Hank had been the final ally they had in their escape? The last man to help them find freedom? Sandra left Hank's cottage with a heavy heart. She had gotten what she needed, proof that the Anglins had made it out of Alcatraz, that they had survived. But the real story was more complicated than she had ever imagined. The men hadn't just escaped, they had planned meticulously, relying on people like Hank to help them disappear completely. The truth was finally coming to light. The men weren't just outlaws, they were survivors. They had won their freedom, but at a price. The journey to Mendocino felt like a step into another world. As Sandra drove along the winding, coastal highways of Northern California, the air grew cooler, the sea breeze carrying a sense of mystery. The landscape here was stark and beautiful, rugged cliffs met the ocean in dramatic displays, and the dense forest loomed over the highway, nearly swallowing it whole. Mendocino was remote, isolated, and, to Sandra's growing sense of unease, it felt like the perfect place to disappear. Hank Turner had given her a name, a small, run-down inn where the Anglins might have found refuge after their escape. Sandra wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain: this was the final leg of her investigation. Either she would uncover the truth, or she would walk away with more questions than answers. Sandra pulled into the small town of Mendocino just as the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the cliffside. The town was quieter than she expected, with only a few tourists wandering the streets. She made her way to the inn Hank had mentioned, an unassuming building at the edge of the town, nestled between towering pines. The inn had the look of a forgotten relic, with its faded sign hanging crookedly above the door and the porch steps creaking beneath her feet. She stepped inside to find the lobby dimly lit, with an old receptionist sitting behind the counter, looking bored. Sandra introduced herself, explaining that she was looking into the history of the area and had heard that the inn had been around for decades. The receptionist, an elderly woman with wisps of white hair, seemed uninterested at first. But when Sandra mentioned the escapees from Alcatraz, the woman's demeanor changed almost instantly. "You're the one asking about them?" the receptionist asked, her voice low and guarded. "I've heard the rumors. Some say they were here. Some say they weren't. I don't know what to believe, but there are stories, and not all of them are kind." Sandra pressed her for more information, but the woman refused to say much, only offering a vague direction toward the inn's old caretaker, a man named Bill Ferguson. "He might know more about those men. But be warned, he doesn't talk about them much." Bill Ferguson was a man in his late 70s, living in a small, weathered house behind the inn. Sandra found him sitting on a rickety porch, staring out at the ocean as if he had been waiting for her. His grizzled face and weathered hands suggested a lifetime of hard work, and his eyes were sharp, alert, yet resigned. When Sandra introduced herself, Bill didn't immediately respond. Instead, he motioned for her to sit down, handing her a glass of strong iced tea before speaking. "I heard you were asking about the Anglins," he said, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't used it much recently. "I don't know what you're after, but I can tell you one thing. Those boys didn't just disappear. They found what they were looking for out here, just like Hank said. Sandra's pulse quickened. Bill was speaking openly now, but what did he know? And how much of it was the truth? Bill leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he began to recount what he knew. I met the Anglins years ago. They came through here, quiet as ghosts. But they weren't alone. Frank Morris was with them, too. They didn't just escape from Alcatraz, they escaped from everything. They didn't want to be found. Sandra listened intently as Bill spoke about his brief encounters with the escapees. According to Bill, they had arrived at the inn in the early 1960s, soon after their escape from the island. They didn't stay long, just a few weeks, but during that time, they kept to themselves. Bill had offered them work around the inn in exchange for a place to stay, but they were always cautious, never revealing too much about their past. They weren't like the usual runaways we got through here. These men had a plan. They were smart, dangerously so. They knew how to hide in plain sight. They could blend in with anyone, anywhere. Bill's eyes darkened as he continued. But they weren't here for long. One night, they just left. No warning. They didn't say where they were going. But there were whispers about a place deep in the forest, a place even I didn't know about. Sandra asked Bill if he had any idea where that place might be. Bill's eyes flickered, and for the first time, there was a trace of fear in his voice. I think they went into the Lost Coast, Bill said, his voice barely a whisper. It's a part of the forest no one dares go. It's isolated, and not even the most experienced hikers will go there. But that's where I think they went. That's where they vanished. The Lost Coast was a name that had come up in Sandra's research, but she had never thought much of it. It was a stretch of land along the coast that was virtually untouched by modern civilization, a place that had been largely ignored by both tourists and authorities. They went up the coast, deeper into the trees, Bill continued. I've heard stories. Strange things about people who have gone there, never to return. It's as if the land itself keeps people away. I reckon the Anglins knew that. They needed a place that no one could find them. Sandra's mind raced. The Lost Coast could be the final destination, the last place where the escapees could have hidden themselves for decades. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but there was still one thing that lingered in Sandra's mind. But what happened to them? Did they survive? Bill fell silent for a long moment before answering. I don't know. I think they made it. But after that night, I never saw them again. The woods are full of secrets, Sandra. Some of them are meant to stay hidden. Sandra left Bill's house with a mix of emotions. The sense of closure she had hoped for remained just out of reach, but the evidence was undeniable. The Anglins had escaped, and they had made their way to the Lost Coast, where they might have disappeared into the wild, leaving behind no trace of their existence. The journey to uncover their story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The Lost Coast was an enigma. Sandra had heard the name spoken with a mix of awe and fear, but now, with the sun sinking low on the horizon and the coastal mist swirling around her, it felt like the threshold to another world. A world where secrets were buried deep within the ancient, towering trees, and where even the most seasoned travelers feared to tread. Sandra had spent days preparing for this trip, gathering supplies, checking maps, and researching every possible route. She had to be careful. The Lost Coast was known for its rugged terrain and unpredictable weather. One wrong step, and she could easily find herself lost, just like so many before her. The road to the Lost Coast was a lonely one, winding through thick forests and across jagged cliffs. She had to drive slow, maneuvering around fallen branches and patches of mud that threatened to slide her off the narrow path. The deeper she went into the wilderness, the more the feeling of being watched grew, and with every mile, the sense of unease in her gut intensified. By the time Sandra arrived at the trailhead leading into the heart of the Lost Coast, it was nearly dark. She grabbed her backpack, adjusted her boots, and took a deep breath before plunging into the thick forest. The path was narrow and overgrown, barely visible under the dense canopy above her. The air was thick with the scent of wet moss and earth. As Sandra ventured deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world outside seemed to fade. The calls of birds and rustling of leaves were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by her footsteps. The forest here was dense, the trees impossibly tall, their trunks thick and ancient, like sentinels guarding some ancient truth. She thought about the stories Bill Ferguson had told her. The Lost Coast was more than just a remote stretch of land, it was unforgiving, a place that swallowed up those who dared to venture too far. Sandra had a job to do, and the truth was now within her reach. She was determined not to let fear or doubt get in her way. But as the minutes turned into hours, and the dim light of the forest gave way to total darkness, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone. The trees seemed to shift, their twisted shapes giving the impression of something lurking just beyond her sight. "Focus," Sandra whispered to herself. "There's no turning back now." Her flashlight illuminated the narrow trail ahead, casting eerie shadows on the moss-covered ground. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and adding an almost haunting layer to the already tense atmosphere. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to be following her. After hours of trekking through the dense forest, Sandra began to see signs that she was not the first to walk this path. Small markers, scratches on trees, disturbed soil, and even a few pieces of old rope, seemed to suggest someone had passed this way before. Was it the Anglins? Or had someone else come to investigate the place where they had disappeared? Her heart raced as she continued. The path began to split into several directions, and Sandra chose the one that seemed the most traveled. Her intuition guided her, even though she knew she was walking into the unknown. It was when she reached a small clearing that the strangest thing happened. Footprints. They were large, worn, and faded with time, but still distinct enough to catch her attention. They were unlike any she had seen before, heavy boots, probably worn by men who had been living off the land. This has to be it, Sandra thought, her pulse quickening. These footprints could be a sign of the escapee's presence, or at least, someone who knew how to navigate this harsh terrain. She crouched down to examine them more closely, but just as she reached out, a noise came from behind her. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, a crackling in the underbrush, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged, a man, tall and rugged, dressed in worn hiking gear. His face was obscured by a thick beard and the hood of his jacket, but Sandra could see the sharpness in his eyes. "I didn't think anyone else would be out here," the man said, his voice deep but friendly. "Most people get spooked and turn back long before they hit the Lost Coast." Sandra was cautious but relieved. It was rare to find someone else so far out in these woods. "What are you doing out here?" Sandra asked. "This place is dangerous." The man chuckled, but there was something in his laughter that didn't sit right with Sandra. "I know these woods better than most," he replied, taking a step closer. "And you're looking for something, aren't you?" Sandra froze. Her instincts told her to back away, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "What do you mean?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. The man smiled, a knowing glint in his eye. "I know who you're looking for. The Anglins, right?" He paused, letting the name linger in the air. "You're not the first to come searching. You won't be the last either. But I wouldn't go any further. The Lost Coast has a way of making people forget what they came for." Sandra's stomach dropped. Had this man known the Anglins? Was he part of the mystery, or was he simply someone who had stumbled onto their trail? The man's cryptic words rang in Sandra's mind as she stood in the clearing, trying to decide her next move. Could she trust him? Did he know something vital about the Anglins' fate, or was he just trying to turn her away from the truth? You don't have to go any further, the man said, sensing her hesitation. The deeper you go, the less likely you are to find what you're looking for. The lost coast keeps its secrets, and not all of them are meant to be uncovered. Sandra was caught between her desire for answers and the growing sense that she might be crossing a line she could never return from. What if she was getting too close to something dangerous? Something that was never meant to be found? With a final glance at the man, Sandra made her decision. She couldn't turn back now. She had come too far. I'm going to keep going, Sandra said firmly, locking eyes with the stranger. I have to know the truth. The deeper Sandra ventured into the forest, the more the world around her seemed to shrink. The thick, ancient trees pressed in from every side, their towering trunks blotting out the sky. The air was cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of earth and moss. Her flashlight's beam flickered in the growing darkness, but she refused to let the sense of isolation take root in her mind. As she moved forward, the ground became more uneven. The trail, if it could still be called that, had all but disappeared, swallowed by the relentless growth of ivy, ferns, and underbrush. The sounds of the outside world, birds, wind, even the faint hum of traffic, were long gone, replaced by the whispers of the forest itself. Sandra's only company was the steady rhythm of her breath and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She felt the weight of the forest around her, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something inevitable. Hours had passed since Sandra had encountered the strange man in the clearing. She hadn't seen him again, but his words lingered like a shadow over her thoughts. The lost coast keeps its secrets, he had said. She had to know what that meant. The deeper she went, the more the sense of disorientation grew. She had been following the trail of footprints for what felt like miles, but now it seemed to disappear entirely. The path ahead was blocked by thick undergrowth, and she had no choice but to choose a new direction. It was then that she saw it, a clearing, a place where the trees suddenly gave way to a wide open space. The air was still here, eerily so. Sandra paused, her instincts on high alert. Something was different. The forest around the clearing felt too quiet, too perfect. In the middle of the clearing stood a single structure, a dilapidated cabin, half sunken into the earth as if the forest itself had started to reclaim it. The roof was covered in layers of moss, and the windows were boarded up. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there was something about it that gave Sandra pause. This was it. This was what she had been searching for. Sandra moved cautiously toward the cabin, each step weighted with anticipation. The boards on the front door were weathered, and some of them were loose. She could see through the cracks that the interior was dark and shrouded in shadow, but there was no sound of movement, no indication that anyone was inside. With a deep breath, Sandra pushed the door open, the wood creaking loudly in the otherwise silent forest. The smell inside was stale, like old wood and dust. The room beyond was small, cluttered with the remains of old furniture, a few broken-down chairs, and remnants of what might have been a fireplace long ago. It was hard to believe anyone had lived here recently, but there was something about the place that felt alive. Sandra's flashlight flicked over the walls, casting long shadows that danced across the surfaces. Then, she saw it, a series of scratches on the wall, not just marks from age or decay, but patterns. They were deliberate, etched into the wood, like someone had been counting the days. Her heart raced as she approached the wall, leaning in to get a closer look. There was a pattern, 3 sets of lines, each marked with a number beside them, faded but still legible, 1962, 1963, 1964. Could these be dates? Was this the work of the Anglins, marking time as they waited out their escape in this forgotten corner of the world? Sandra's fingers brushed the markings, tracing the deep grooves. It felt as though she were touching the past itself, the lives of the men who had escaped from Alcatraz, who had come here to hide, to live. Beside the wall, tucked into a dusty corner, was a small wooden box. Sandra approached it cautiously, half expecting it to be empty. But when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside, There was an old leather journal, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. The moment Sandra laid her hands on it, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. She opened the journal carefully, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. The handwriting was uneven, sometimes hurried, sometimes neat, as though the writer was trying to record thoughts before they slipped away. The entries were sporadic, with large gaps of time between them. But as she read, Sandra began to see a story unfold, one that seemed to confirm everything she had heard and more. The first entry was dated 1962, shortly after the escape. "It's been 3 days since we left. The escape was harder than we thought, but we made it. We found a place, somewhere safe, for now. The forest is dense, but it feels like we've finally found somewhere no one can find us." Sandra's heart raced as she read. It was written by Frank Morris, the mastermind behind the Alcatraz escape. The next few pages chronicled their journey into the Lost Coast, describing the difficulties of surviving in the wild, of finding food, shelter, and staying hidden from the authorities. As Sandra continued reading, the entries grew darker. "We've been here longer than we expected. The woods aren't as safe as they seemed. We've heard noises in the night, voices, people coming closer. It feels like they're getting too close. But we can't leave. Not yet." The next entry was dated 1964, and it was the last entry in the journal. "I don't know how much longer we can last. It feels like time is running out. We've been here too long, and the world is catching up. If anyone finds this, we were here, and we made it for a while. We were free. But freedom is fragile." Sandra closed the journal slowly, her mind reeling. This was it. She had found the truth. The Englans, along with Frank Morris, had made it to the Lost Coast, and they had lived here for years, hidden from the world, surviving off the land. But in the end, something had happened. Something that had forced them to leave, or perhaps, had taken them. As Sandra stood in the cabin, absorbing the weight of what she had discovered, she heard a rustling noise behind her. Her heart skipped a beat. She spun around, her flashlight sweeping the room in a frantic search for movement. But there was nothing. Nothing but the darkness. And then, a voice, a whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." Sandra froze, the journal slipping from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. She wasn't alone anymore. Sandra's breath caught in her chest as the voice echoed through the cabin. It was low and raspy, almost like the whisper of someone who had been lost to time. She spun around, the flashlight shaking in her hand, her heart pounding in her ears. The cabin was empty. No one was there. But the voice had been so clear, so real. "You shouldn't have come here." The word seemed to hang in the air, heavy and oppressive. Her mind raced. Was it a trick of the wind? A figment of her imagination, spurred by the isolation of the forest and the tension of what she had just discovered? Or was there someone, or something, else out here? Sandra took a step back, her pulse quickening as she scanned the dark corners of the room. She felt the walls pressing in on her, the oppressive silence now magnified. The journal, now lying on the floor, seemed to taunt her. The truth she had uncovered, and the growing realization that there were others who knew more than they let on. "Who's there?" Sandra's voice was barely a whisper. The words felt ridiculous, hanging in the air like an unanswered question. For a long moment, there was nothing but the wind outside, rustling the leaves. The forest was silent, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. And then, she heard it again, closer this time, almost as if it were coming from within the walls. "I told you. You shouldn't have come here." Sandra's skin prickled with cold dread. The voice wasn't just a whisper, it was a warning. But who was it? Who had spoken those words? Before she could react, there was another sound, this time, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard from behind her. Sandra whirled around, her flashlight flicking over the cabin's interior in a frenzy. Her eyes darted to every corner, but all she saw were the same shadows, the same eerie silence. But then, she saw it, a shadow at the window. It was moving, too fast for her to catch clearly. Sandra's heart raced, and without thinking, she rushed to the door. She flung it open, nearly stumbling in her haste to escape the cabin. The cool night air hit her face like a slap, and the darkness outside seemed to swallow her whole. Sandra's legs were shaking as she stepped into the clearing, her mind still racing to make sense of what had just happened. The voices. The shadows. There was something here, something hidden, and Sandra was starting to realize she was far from alone in the lost coast. Her flashlight beam danced across the clearing, but all she could see were the thick trees surrounding her, standing as silent witnesses to the secrets that had been buried here for decades. Suddenly, she heard movement to her left, and she whipped around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, just beyond the trees, she saw them, figures. 3 of them, moving silently through the underbrush. They were tall, thin, and dressed in clothes that seemed to blend seamlessly with the forest around them. They moved with an eerie grace, like shadows that could shift and disappear at will. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to run, to flee from whatever this was, but her feet were rooted to the ground. She had to know. "Who are you?" Sandra called out, her voice hoarse with fear. The figures didn't answer immediately. They just kept moving, closer and closer, until they emerged from the darkness, their faces now visible. Sandra gasped. They weren't ordinary people. Their features were gaunt, hollow, almost ghostly, as if the years had drained the life from them. Their eyes were sunken, but their gaze was sharp, intense. One of the figures stepped forward, a man with a weathered face, his eyes locked onto Sandra's. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice rough, but with an undeniable authority. Sandra's heart hammered in her chest. The man's words were the same as the voice she had heard in the cabin. It was him, or someone who knew the same secret. But what secret was he guarding so fiercely? "Who are you?" Sandra repeated, her voice steadier now. "What is this place?" The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as though weighing her worth. Then, he nodded to the others behind him. "You found us," he said simply. "You found the lost ones." The words hung in the air like a heavy mist. Sandra didn't understand. The lost ones? Who were these people? And why had they been hiding out here in the forest? The man stepped closer, motioning for Sandra to follow him. He didn't wait for her to respond, simply turned and began walking toward the edge of the clearing, where a narrow path led deeper into the woods. "Come," he said. "You have questions. We have answers. But not here. Not in the open." Sandra hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow. There was no turning back now. She had already uncovered too much, and the mystery was pulling her forward, like an invisible force. As they moved deeper into the forest, Sandra's mind raced. These figures, these lost ones, had to be connected to the Anglins. There was no other explanation. Had they been hiding all this time? Were they somehow part of the Anglin brothers' escape, or were they survivors from a different time? The man led her down a narrow trail that twisted and turned through the trees. The forest seemed even darker now, the canopy above blocking out most of the moonlight. It felt as though the world had become a tunnel, everything narrowing, pulling her deeper into its grasp. After what felt like an eternity of walking in silence, they arrived at another clearing, this one larger, with a small structure in the center. It was a cabin, similar to the one Sandra had found earlier, but much larger and more intact. The door was open, and a faint light flickered from inside. The man turned to Sandra, his eyes never leaving her face. "This is where the truth lies," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Inside, you'll find the answers you're looking for. But be warned, you may not like everything you learn." Sandra stepped forward, her mind racing with possibilities. What was inside this cabin? What was so important that they had been hiding it out here for so long? The man motioned for her to enter. Sandra pushed the door open, stepping into the dim light of the cabin. Inside, there were shelves filled with old books, papers, and maps. The walls were covered in photographs, some yellowed with age, others too new, too fresh. At the center of the room, a large table was covered with even more documents. Maps of the lost coast, old newspaper clippings, and faded blueprints. And there, in the middle, a series of photographs that made Sandra's blood run cold. One of them was a picture of the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, smiling, looking far younger than they had been when they escaped from Alcatraz. Beside the photo was another image, one Sandra hadn't expected to see. It was Frank Morris, alive, sitting with the Anglins in the very same cabin. Sandra's mind spun as she stood before the photographs of the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris, alive, together, in this cabin. The weight of the discovery settled heavily on her shoulders. For years, it had been a mystery, a legend, the great escape from Alcatraz. But this? This was something far greater than a simple escape. She turned to the man who had led her here, the same one who had whispered warnings and led her through the forest. His eyes were intense, almost as though he were studying her, weighing her every thought. "What is this?" Sandra asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the shock clear in her tone. "How is this possible? They were supposed to be dead." The man didn't answer immediately. He stepped toward the table, running his fingers over the faded blueprints and maps. His expression was somber, almost resigned. "It was never about dying," he said softly. "It was about living. Escaping. Hiding." He glanced back at her. "And we've been hiding here ever since." Sandra's heart pounded. This was more than she had bargained for. The lost coast, the figures in the forest, the mysterious cabin, it was all connected. But how? And why? The answers felt close now, tantalizingly close, but something was holding her back from fully grasping the truth. The man motioned for Sandra to sit. He reached into a drawer beneath the table and pulled out an old folder, its edges frayed with age. He slid it across to her, and she opened it with trembling hands. Inside were more photographs, documents, and letters, each one more perplexing than the last. One letter caught Sandra's attention. It was addressed to a man named George, written in the unmistakable handwriting of Frank Morris. "George. We've done it. The escape worked. But not as we expected. The authorities think we're dead, but we're far from it. We found a place, deep in the lost coast. It's isolated, hidden, and no one will come looking for us here. This is the beginning of a new life." Sandra's breath hitched as she read. The words confirmed it. Frank Morris, along with the Anglins, had survived their escape. They had disappeared into the wilds of the lost coast, hidden from the world, and no one had known. But then came the shocking part. "We know we can't stay here forever. Time is running out. But we've made a decision. We will not live in fear. We've survived everything Alcatraz threw at us, and we will survive here too. The world will never know what really happened, but we will." Sandra looked up, her eyes wide. Survived everything Alcatraz threw at us. What did that mean? Had they stayed hidden, as the letter suggested? And if so, why had they never come back? Why hadn't anyone heard from them again? The man who had brought her here stood silent, watching Sandra carefully. She could tell he was waiting for her to understand, for the pieces to fall into place. "So they're still alive," Sandra said, her voice barely a breath. "They were here, in this place, all along." The man nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her. "They were here," he confirmed. "But not for long." Sandra looked down at the letter again, feeling the weight of its words settle into her chest. It was as though the escape wasn't the end of their story, but merely the beginning. A beginning of a life in hiding, far from the world that had once confined them. But that couldn't last forever. And as the man had said, time was running out. Her eyes flickered over the maps on the table, tracing the paths of the men as they had ventured deeper into the wilderness. The maps seemed to show every step of their journey, every place they had gone. Some parts were marked with notes, others with lines that had long since faded, as though someone had been charting their survival for decades. What happened to them? Sandra asked, her voice filled with a deep curiosity, and perhaps a bit of fear. Where are they now? The man remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the question hanging heavily in the air. You don't want to know, he said, his voice low. Not really. Sandra stared at him, confusion flooding her thoughts. What did that mean? What could be so terrible about the truth that even the man, who had clearly known them, wouldn't speak it aloud? Tell me, Sandra insisted. I need to know what happened. The man finally sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. He sat down across from Sandra, his expression hardening. Frank and the Anglins didn't just run away from Alcatraz, he said, his eyes narrowing. They ran toward something. Something they thought would keep them safe. But it didn't. In the end, it's what destroyed them. Sandra leaned in, her pulse quickening. She had been chasing this story for months. She had been so close, but now it felt like the pieces were finally falling into place. What was it? She asked. The man paused, then spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word were a stone in a river that might shift everything. It was the coast. The land. The forest. Something about this place, it's cursed, you could say. It draws people in, but it never lets them go. The people who came here, Frank, the Anglins, they didn't just escape Alcatraz. They tried to escape themselves. And the forest, the land itself, it didn't let them leave. Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. This was no ordinary place. The lost coast was something far more mysterious, and far more dangerous, than she had ever imagined. So they're dead? Sandra asked, her voice trembling. The man's eyes locked with hers. Not dead, he said, his voice grim. Just, lost. Sandra's mind spun. Lost. What did that mean? Had the men simply vanished, consumed by the wilderness? Or had something darker happened to them? And why had they never returned to the world? As the man stood up, his face darkened, and Sandra felt the weight of the truth settle in her chest. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some things, once uncovered, could never be erased. You've seen too much, the man said quietly, his voice heavy with a kind of regret. Now you have to decide. Will you walk away, or will you become a part of the Lost Coast story too? Sandra's heart raced. The journey she had undertaken, the quest for the truth, had led her here, into a world that was far darker and more complex than she could ever have imagined. She had uncovered the truth, but now she had to face the consequences of that knowledge. Her eyes glanced toward the door, toward the dense forest beyond. There was no turning back now. Sandra's breath was shallow as she stood at the edge of the forest, the cold night air biting at her skin. She could still feel the weight of the man's words pressing down on her chest, heavy and suffocating. The Lost Coast was more than just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, drawing people in and never letting them go. And now, she was part of its story. The man's words echoed in her mind, the choice hanging in the air like a shadow. Will you walk away, or will you become a part of the Lost Coast story too? Sandra closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. She had spent so many months chasing the truth, seeking answers, driven by a need to uncover what had happened to the men who had disappeared into these woods. She had found it, the truth, the haunting reality of their survival. But now that she had it, she was faced with a terrifying question: what would she do with it? She could walk away. She could leave the cabin behind, return to the world where things made sense. But something inside her, a force that had driven her this far, pushed her to stay. The mystery wasn't over. There was more to uncover, more pieces of the puzzle that needed to be put together. And yet, the man's warning lingered in her mind. The lost coast had claimed so many others, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way he spoke, as though the forest itself could reach out and swallow her whole if she wasn't careful. Sandra's eyes darted to the horizon. The forest stretched out before her, dark and endless, a labyrinth that promised both answers and danger. She could feel it, the pull. The same pull that had drawn Frank Morris and the Anglins here all those years ago. But had they known what they were walking into? Had they understood the price of their escape? What will you do? The man's voice was a whisper in the still night, almost as if the forest itself was asking her the question. Sandra clenched her fists, determination settling into her bones. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The truth wasn't something she could just walk away from. She had to finish what she started, even if it meant walking deeper into the unknown. She turned back to the man, her eyes steady. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "Not yet. There's more here. I need to know what happened to them." The man nodded, as though he had been expecting this answer. He turned and began walking back toward the cabin, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Sandra followed, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. The man led Sandra through the cabin, past the cluttered table filled with old maps and photographs. He paused at a wall near the back, where a large, weathered painting hung. It depicted a ship. A ghostly, faded image of a vessel navigating through turbulent seas. The water was dark, almost black, and the sky above it was filled with swirling clouds, as though the world itself was in turmoil. Sandra studied the painting, her eyes narrowing. There was something familiar about it, something that felt out of place. "What is this?" she asked, her voice curious. The man's face hardened as he looked at the painting. "That ship," he began, his voice low, "was the last escape. Not just for Frank and the Anglins, but for all of us. We came here, but we were always trying to leave. Always trying to escape again." Sandra turned to face him, her mind racing. This was more than just a place to hide, it was a prison, a trap that no one could escape from. The lost coast wasn't just where the men had come to disappear, it was where they had tried to disappear forever, to get away from the world that had been chasing them. But in the end, they hadn't been able to leave. What happened to them? Sandra asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. The man's gaze softened, and for a moment, he seemed almost nostalgic. "They didn't want to be found," he said quietly. "But they couldn't leave the forest. This place, it's cursed. It draws you in and won't let you go. You can run, you can hide, but in the end, it takes you." Sandra felt a chill run down her spine. She could see it now, the way the lost coast had become a part of them, a part of their very being. They had escaped Alcatraz, but they hadn't truly escaped at all. They had run into the arms of something far darker. The man took a deep breath and walked toward the table, pulling out another document. He slid it across to Sandra. It was a journal, its pages worn with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Frank Morris. "We thought we were free. We thought we had escaped. But we've learned something here. Something that changes everything. The forest, this place, has a power over us. And it's taking us one by one." Sandra's hands shook as she read the words, her mind reeling. It wasn't just a story of survival anymore. It was a story of something far darker, something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The men hadn't just been hiding, they had been running from something that was hunting them, something they couldn't escape. "We've made a decision. The only way to escape this place is to leave it behind completely. We have to let go, let everything go. Only then will we be free. But the forest won't let us go without a fight. We've made our peace with that." Sandra felt her heart sink as she finished reading. The men had known. They had known that the forest had a hold on them, a hold that they couldn't break. They had made their peace with it, accepting that they were forever a part of this place. "Are they still here?" Sandra asked, her voice barely audible. The man looked at her, his expression somber. "They are. Somewhere in the forest. The forest doesn't let go of its own. And they, Frank and the Anglins, they're still here, trapped in this place. Part of the lost coast. Forever." Sandra felt the weight of his words crash over her, suffocating her with their truth. The lost coast had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many others before them. And now, it was reaching out for her, too. The cabin felt colder now, the shadows in the corners seeming to grow darker with each passing moment. Sandra could feel the pull of the forest, its unseen grip wrapping around her heart. "You don't have to stay," the man said, his voice soft, almost a plea. "You can leave now. The coast won't come after you if you leave now." Sandra stood there, the journal clutched in her hands, her thoughts swirling like the storm in the painting. The truth was clear now. The lost coast was no mere mystery, it was a living, breathing entity, a place that claimed those who dared to seek refuge in its shadows. But was she ready to let it go? Was she ready to walk away and leave the truth buried, to forget everything she had uncovered? She had chased the story this far. She had uncovered pieces of the puzzle. She couldn't walk away now. But at what cost? Sandra took a deep breath, making her decision. The truth had to be told, no matter what. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice steady with resolve. "The world needs to know. The truth needs to come out." The man's expression softened, as though he had been expecting this answer all along. "Then you will become part of the Lost Coast story too," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sandra nodded. She had made her choice. The morning light barely pierced the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Sandra stood at the edge of the forest, feeling the weight of the previous night's revelations pressing down on her. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. The lost coast had claimed the Anglins and Frank Morris, and it seemed to be trying to claim her as well. But Sandra wasn't going to let it, at least not without a fight. The man who had guided her through the cabin and shared the haunting history of the lost coast hadn't spoken since their conversation. He had retreated into the shadows, leaving her to process everything she had learned. But the silence around her was deafening. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for her next move. Sandra glanced over at the cabin, its wooden structure almost swallowed by the forest. The storm from the night before had passed, but the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. She could almost feel the forest pressing in, like a living thing, waiting for her to make a mistake. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, maybe some kind of sign, a clue that would make everything clearer. But the only thing she could hear now was the wind whispering through the trees. The forest was alive, but it was also silent, a kind of silence that was heavy with foreboding. "What now?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. She didn't expect an answer. She never did. But the forest seemed to respond anyway. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and something, somewhere, seemed to shift in the distance. A presence, watching her every move. Sandra swallowed hard, forcing herself to look away from the trees and back toward the cabin. She had to go deeper into the forest, she knew that. The answers were out there. Frank, the Anglins, the others, they were out there, lost, and it was time to confront whatever had trapped them in this cursed place. Sandra packed a small bag with the essentials, water, a flashlight, the journal she had found in the cabin, and a few other items that might help her survive in the wilderness. As she gathered her things, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The lost coast wasn't just a physical location. It was something more, a presence that seemed to seep into your soul, pulling at you, forcing you to confront the darkest parts of yourself. She felt it now, the pull. It was as if the forest was calling to her, urging her to step into the unknown, to follow the path that had once led Frank and the Englunds to their doom. But she wasn't afraid. Not yet. Sandra stepped out of the cabin and into the dense woods, the towering trees looming over her like silent sentinels. The trail was faint, barely visible through the underbrush, but she could see the remnants of old markings, faint symbols carved into the bark of the trees. She followed them, her heart pounding in her chest. The further she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and every rustling leaf sounded like a whisper just out of reach. The deeper she ventured, the more she felt it, the sense that she wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was watching her every move. She pushed forward, determined to uncover the final piece of the puzzle. As she walked, she thought about the letters Frank and the Englunds had written. They had come here seeking freedom, thinking they had escaped Alcatraz. But what had they found instead? The journal had spoken of traps, of the forest's hold on them. It had said that the forest didn't let go, that it consumed those who tried to escape. But what did that mean? Had the forest trapped Frank and the Englunds, or was there something else at work here? As the day wore on, Sandra felt the eerie sense of being watched intensify. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching in unnatural directions. The forest, which had seemed calm at first, now felt alive, restless. She could hear the distant calls of animals, but there was something wrong about them, too sharp, too purposeful, as if they were trying to communicate something. Sandra stopped for a moment, trying to catch her breath. She hadn't realized how far she had come, how deep into the forest she had ventured. The path had all but disappeared, replaced by thick underbrush and twisted roots that made it harder to navigate. The trees seemed to close in around her, blocking out the sky above. What am I looking for? She muttered to herself. She didn't know. She didn't know what she was expecting to find out here in the forest. But she felt it, the same pull that had drawn Frank and the Englunds here. It was as if the forest itself was guiding her, pushing her towards something, towards some final truth. And then, she saw it. Up ahead, through the trees, she spotted something faintly visible, a faint glow, almost like a fire. She froze, her heart racing. It wasn't a campfire. It was too steady, too constant. But it was light, light in the middle of the forest. Without thinking, she moved toward it, her feet carrying her faster than she had meant. Her breath quickened, and the sense of foreboding grew heavier, but she couldn't stop. The light called to her, as though it were beckoning her toward the final answer. As she neared the source of the light, Sandra's pulse quickened. The glow was coming from an opening in the trees, and as she stepped into the clearing, she was struck by the sight before her. There, in the center of the clearing, was a circle, a strange, glowing sigil carved into the ground. It wasn't a natural formation, it looked deliberate, almost as though someone had made it. The symbols were ancient, unfamiliar, and they glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was the heart of the lost coast, the source of the pull, the trap that had ensnared Frank, the Englunds, and anyone else foolish enough to seek refuge here. But there was more. Around the edges of the circle lay bones, human remains, scattered in a way that was almost ritualistic. Sandra felt her stomach churn as she took in the sight. These weren't the remains of just anyone. These were the remains of people who had come here, seeking freedom, and had never left. No, she whispered. This is where they ended up. Sandra took a step back, her heart racing. The forest hadn't just trapped them, it had consumed them, taken their souls, their very essence, and used them to fuel whatever dark force lay at its heart. It's too late, a voice said, causing Sandra to freeze in place. She spun around, her eyes wide with shock. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the man, the same one who had led her to this place. He stepped forward, his eyes dark and filled with sorrow. It's too late for all of us, he said, his voice low. The forest has taken them. And now, it's coming for you too. Sandra felt the weight of his words settle over her like a suffocating blanket. The truth was clear now. The Lost Coast wasn't just a place, it was a force, an ancient, malevolent presence that had trapped all who came here, consuming them until they were nothing more than part of the forest. She had uncovered the truth, but now she faced the ultimate choice. Would she leave, or would she become a part of the forest story too? Her heart raced. The Lost Coast had taken so many before her. Could she escape it, or would she become another lost soul, swallowed by its dark embrace? The air was still, thick with the weight of the unknown. Sandra stood at the edge of the glowing sigil, her feet rooted to the ground, her heart hammering in her chest. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for her to make a decision. The man stood nearby, watching her with eyes that were filled with an unsettling mix of pity and resignation. "It's too late," he repeated softly, his voice carrying an edge of sorrow. "You can't run from it. You can't escape what's coming." Sandra's mind was spinning. Everything she had uncovered, everything she had learned, was crashing together in a chaotic wave of realization. The Lost Coast wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, feeding on the lost, trapping them in its embrace. Frank Morris, the Anglins, and countless others had come here seeking freedom, only to be consumed by the forest, their bodies and souls absorbed into its dark power. But now, Sandra faced the ultimate question: would she leave, or would she remain, risking her own fate in the pursuit of truth? She turned her gaze back to the man, her breath steadying. His words had struck deep, but she couldn't back down now. She had come too far to walk away. "There has to be a way out of here," she said, her voice firm. "The others, they were lost, but I'm not like them. I didn't come here to disappear. I came to uncover the truth, to show the world what really happened." The man shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "The truth you seek, it's not what you think. The Lost Coast, this place, it doesn't care about your truth. It will take you just like it took the others." Sandra swallowed hard, a chill running down her spine. The forest seemed to respond to his words, the wind picking up and rustling the leaves above them. It was as if the trees themselves were whispering, urging her to leave, to turn back before it was too late. But Sandra couldn't. She wouldn't. "I came here for the truth," she said again, louder now, her voice filled with resolve. "And I'll face whatever it takes to find it." For a moment, the man just stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something darker, something she couldn't quite place. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped back, disappearing into the trees without another word. Sandra stood alone in the clearing, the sigil glowing faintly beneath her feet, the remains of those who had come before her scattered around her. She felt a pang of sorrow for them, for the men who had come to this forsaken place hoping to escape only to find themselves trapped forever. But she couldn't allow their fate to be hers. She wasn't going to be lost. Not like them. The forest had grown eerily quiet once the man left, the only sound now the faint hum of the sigil beneath her feet. Sandra's breath quickened as she crouched beside one of the skeletal remains, her hands trembling as she reached for a piece of cloth, what appeared to be an old jacket. It was too small to belong to Frank or the Anglins, but it had the same weathered look as the clothing she had seen in the cabin. She stared at it for a long moment, her mind racing. This place, it wasn't just about survival. It was about something darker, something that had been feeding on those who sought refuge here for decades. And now, it was her turn. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, the branches above creaking as if responding to the disturbance. Sandra stood quickly, her eyes darting toward the edge of the forest. She had been warned. She had been told that the forest didn't let go of its own. But now, as she stood there, feeling the oppressive weight of the Lost Coast closing in on her, she understood what that really meant. She wasn't just standing in a place. She was standing in a trap. The forest was alive, and it wasn't going to let her leave. It had taken so many before her, and it was ready to take her too. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment as she prepared for the next step. She couldn't escape this place by running. If she was going to survive, she would have to confront whatever force was at work here. The truth she had uncovered, it had a cost. And now she had to pay it. Sandra turned toward the center of the sigil, her eyes locked on the faint, glowing symbols beneath her feet. The forest seemed to pulse, its energy growing stronger, more insistent. There was a deep, unshakable power here, something ancient and hungry. And it wanted her. "I've come too far to turn back now," Sandra muttered to herself, her resolve solidifying. She couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything she had uncovered. The truth will come out. I won't let this place win. With that, she stepped forward, crossing the circle of symbols. As her foot made contact with the ground, a violent shudder ran through the earth beneath her. The air around her seemed to change, becoming heavier, colder, as if the forest was rejecting her. For a moment, she felt her breath catch, her pulse racing as the trees seemed to close in on her. She felt the pressure of the forest's grip tightening around her, pulling her deeper into its embrace. But she held firm, refusing to let it take her. Then, as if the forest itself had accepted her resolve, the air shifted. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time since she had arrived, the forest seemed to let her breathe. She could feel the energy swirling around her, shifting and changing, but no longer suffocating her. Sandra stepped back from the sigil, her heart still pounding in her chest. It was over. The truth had been revealed, and now it was time to face the consequences. A voice broke the silence, low and calm, but filled with a sense of finality. "You've done it," the voice said, and Sandra whipped around to see the man standing at the edge of the clearing once more. "You've faced it. You've uncovered the truth." Sandra stared at him, her heart still racing, but now, there was something different in her gaze. She had survived. She had uncovered the Lost Coast's darkest secret and faced its power head-on. She hadn't been swallowed by it. The man's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of relief in his expression. "The forest won't claim you," he said quietly. "But you're marked. It won't forget you. And neither will the world." Sandra nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't just part of the Lost Coast story now, she was a survivor. The forest had shown her its secrets, but it couldn't take her. Not yet. Sandra's feet hit the pavement of the small town that bordered the Lost Coast like the end of a long, drawn-out nightmare. It was strange to be back, almost as if she were walking on unfamiliar ground. The world seemed ordinary again, too ordinary. The hum of passing cars, the chatter of pedestrians, the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air, it all seemed so out of place after the dark, suffocating silence of the forest. She hadn't expected it to feel like this. After everything she had endured, returning to the real world was like stepping into someone else's life. The forest had marked her, branded her with something she couldn't explain, and it was as though it had left a scar that the world around her couldn't see. The truth was lodged deep in her chest, heavy and unspoken. And yet, it was almost as if it was too much to share. Sandra's heart pounded as she walked through the familiar streets, her mind reeling from the events that had unfolded. The Lost Coast, the sigil, the truth about Frank and the Englands, it was all buried within her, a secret too dark and dangerous to expose to those around her. She needed to find her way home. She needed to find a sense of normalcy again, something that could restore the part of her that the forest had taken. But the closer she got to the small apartment she used to call home, the more she felt the weight of something following her. The Lost Coast had followed her back. There was no escaping it. It was in her mind. It was in her blood. Sandra arrived at her apartment, the place that used to feel like a sanctuary now felt like a cage. She had left in search of answers, and she had found them, but the truth was an insidious thing. The Lost Coast wasn't just a place, it was an idea. A force. And it wasn't content to let her go. As she stepped into her apartment, the familiar sights felt foreign. The couch where she used to relax, the kitchen table where she'd spent countless hours reading, everything seemed distant. There was an unsettling stillness to the place, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sandra sank onto the couch, her body heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't realized how drained she was, emotionally and physically, from everything that had transpired. Her mind raced, unable to slow down. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the sigil in the forest. The circle. The bones. And the faces of those who had come before her, those who had disappeared without a trace. She had survived. But at what cost? Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the heavy silence. She stared at it for a moment before picking it up. It was a message from her brother, Eric. She hadn't spoken to him since she left, and the thought of answering filled her with dread. He didn't know the truth. No one did. "Hey, sis. Just checking in. Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" Sandra stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could she say? How could she explain what had happened? How could she tell him that she had ventured into a dark forest that consumed people, that the truth she had uncovered was too much for anyone to understand? How could she tell him that part of her would never be the same again? Her finger hovered over the send button, but she couldn't bring herself to type anything. Instead, she set the phone down, feeling an overwhelming sense of isolation. The truth wasn't something that could be shared easily. It was too dark. Too dangerous. And now, it was too late. The hours dragged on as Sandra lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. She should have felt relief, she was safe now. The forest was behind her. But there was no relief. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was still with her. The forest, the sigil, the whispers, it was as though it had all followed her home, infecting everything she touched. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? She wasn't expecting anyone, and her instincts told her not to open the door. Not to let anyone in. But then she thought of her brother again. Could it be him? Hesitantly, she stood up and walked to the door, glancing through the peephole. To her surprise, there was no one there. The hall outside was empty. Confused, Sandra opened the door, half expecting something to jump out at her. But the only thing that greeted her was a small package, sitting on the doorstep. There was no return address, no label. Just a plain, brown box. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she hesitated, staring at the box. It seemed harmless enough, but something about it felt wrong. It was as though the forest itself had sent it. Against her better judgment, Sandra crouched down and picked up the box. She carried it inside, setting it on the coffee table. Her hands trembled as she slowly peeled away the tape, revealing the contents. Inside, wrapped in old, yellowing newspaper, was something she hadn't expected, a journal. It looked old, the pages worn with age, the cover cracked and faded. But the moment she touched it, a chill ran through her body. This was no ordinary journal. It was familiar. The handwriting on the first page was unmistakable. Frank Morris. Sandra's heart pounded. The lost coast was not done with her. It was just beginning. The forest had left a mark on her, and now it was calling her back. She didn't know how Frank's journal had ended up at her doorstep. Maybe it was a warning, maybe it was a sign. But it didn't matter. The truth was out there, and the forest still held its secrets. Sandra could feel it in her bones. The forest hadn't just taken the lives of the men who had come before her, it had taken something else. It had taken a part of them, and it had embedded that part in the land itself. Frank's journal, this small, fragile thing, was the last link she had to the past, to the truth that no one else believed. The forest had called to her. And now, it was time to answer. Sandra's hands shook as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with stories, fragmented and broken, but they spoke to her. The truth was more horrifying than she could have ever imagined, but it was undeniable. Sandra sat in the dim light of her apartment, the journal resting open in front of her. The pages, worn and fragile, were filled with scribbled words, strange sketches, and faded memories. It was a haunting record of Frank Morris's life, his final days before he vanished into the very forest that had ensnared her. Every word she read sank her deeper into the mystery of the lost coast. Every sentence revealed more about the forest's ancient power, and every sketch showed the twisted, dark magic that had consumed those who dared to uncover its secrets. The journal described the same sigil that had led her to the forest. It spoke of rituals, of old gods, and of sacrifices made to appease the entity that dwelled in the heart of the lost coast. Frank had written about the whispers, the voices of the forest calling out to those who entered, promising freedom but demanding something in return. Sandra's fingers trembled as she turned the next page. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it, a drawing of the very sigil she had seen in the forest, but with something new, a shadowy figure, a silhouette, emerging from the center of the circle. The forest's heart. It wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, a force that demanded not only the lives of those who entered but their souls. Frank had been consumed by it, just like the others. But there was one crucial detail in the final entry that stopped Sandra's heart cold. It was a warning, written hastily, as if Frank had realized too late what was at stake. It will not let you go. If you know the truth, if you uncover its secrets, it will claim you forever. It wants you. It wants to own you. There is no escape. Sandra closed the journal, her mind racing. Frank's warning echoed in her mind, there is no escape. It was a harsh reality, one she had feared, but the weight of it was unbearable. The lost coast had never truly let anyone go. It had a way of pulling people back, claiming them over time. Frank had been right. It wasn't enough to survive the forest. The forest would always find a way to claim you, either through its whispers or through the people you loved. It always took something. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Eric. "Sis, I'm really starting to worry. You've been gone for so long. I miss you. Please let me know you're okay." The message felt like a rope being thrown to her, a lifeline back to the world she knew. She thought of Eric, her only family left. She thought of the people who cared about her. But there was something inside her now, something she couldn't escape. She knew the truth. She knew what the forest was. And it wasn't something she could tell him. Not now. But then, a part of her whispered, maybe it's not too late. Maybe there's still a way to escape it. Maybe you can save yourself. The forest had never taken her completely, but it wasn't done with her yet. It was still there, lingering in the shadows, watching her every move. Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that the lost coast was reaching into her life, pulling at the very fabric of her existence, ready to drag her back into its depths. Sandra stood up, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had to make. She had uncovered the truth. She had survived the forest. But now, standing in her apartment, she knew that survival alone wasn't enough. She had to make the ultimate choice. Could she leave? Could she walk away from the lost coast and let the world move on without knowing what she had learned? Or would she stay and fight, knowing that the forest would never truly let her go? There was only one thing left to do, return to the forest. She knew that now. If she wanted to break free, she would have to face the heart of the lost coast, confront whatever it was that controlled the forest, and end it once and for all. There would be no more running. No more hiding. It was time to end this. Sandra grabbed the journal and shoved it into her bag. She had everything she needed. Frank's warnings were clear, but she had something he didn't, the truth. She had been marked, but she wasn't going to let it claim her. The drive back to the lost coast was long, each mile feeling like an eternity. The landscape outside her window had changed, but in her mind, it was still the same. The forest was still out there, waiting. It didn't matter how much time had passed. The grip it had on her hadn't loosened. As Sandra neared the edge of the forest, her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. She could feel it now, the pull of the lost coast, the way it reached into her very soul. She had thought she could escape it, but the forest didn't let go that easily. The closer she got to it, the more she felt it tugging at her. She parked the car at the edge of the forest, the trees looming like dark sentinels. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with the energy of the lost coast. Sandra stood there for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she would survive this. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to leave without ending it. Sandra made her way through the dense trees, the path familiar but twisted now, as though the forest was changing, shifting. The sigil was waiting for her, glowing faintly in the distance. It was like a magnet, pulling her toward it. When she reached the clearing, the sigil was already there, glowing brighter than before. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the air crackling with the energy of something ancient, something hungry. And then, she saw it, the figure in the center of the sigil, the shadowy silhouette. It was the heart of the forest, its essence. It was more than a place. It was a consciousness. It spoke to her, not in words, but in a language older than time itself. Sandra could feel it, feel the dark presence reaching out to her, trying to draw her in, to claim her as its own. But this time, Sandra was ready. She raised the journal above her head, the words Frank had written burned into her mind. She knew now what she had to do. The forest wanted her soul, wanted her to become part of it. But Sandra had one thing the forest could never take, her will. With a single, decisive movement, Sandra tore the journal in half, the pages scattering into the wind. The forest howled, a loud, mournful cry, as if the very earth itself was mourning the loss of its power. And then, for the first time, the forest was silent. Sandra stood there, her body trembling, her heart racing. The pull of the lost coast had faded. The forest's grip was gone. The weight that had hung over her for so long was finally lifted. She had escaped. Sandra turned and walked away from the sigil, leaving the lost coast behind. She didn't look back. The forest had taken so much from so many before her. But it hadn't taken her. And as she walked back into the world, she knew that the truth would remain hers, and hers alone. The lost coast would never forget her, but it would never claim her. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?